Good afternoon and welcome to my message of the day. I'm Warren, director here at St. Columba's. God doesn't need us. It's such an important affirmation to make. We see this in Jesus' self-giving on the cross. Jesus didn't give himself 90% for us and 10% for himself. It's entirely for us, and that's what God's like. This is the key to understanding God's activity from creation right through to salvation. It is tempting to think of creation as though God is in some way needing us so that God has something to love, as though God is in some way incomplete without us. But using Jesus' self-giving on the cross as the model for this, I think it's better to look at creation as God's sharing of God's completeness. God doesn't need us. God's giving of God's self through creation, right through to salvation, for our benefit. It's the sharing of God's completeness, God's love, God's grace. Not for God's benefit, but for ours. I've talked before the way in which we can be tempted to think of confession and forgiveness as though it's somehow for God's benefit as well as ours, as though God needs us to do this. God doesn't need us to do this. Confession, so that God can forgive us, is for our benefit, not for God's. You can say this about obedience, about worship, about honouring God. You can start to think that we are required to do these things for God's benefit, as though God needs us to honour God. God doesn't need us to honour God. Honouring God is for our benefit. Worshipping God is for our benefit. These are the means by which God's fullness is shared with us. It's the means by which our hearts can become truer and that we in our humanity can become more complete. When we don't worship God, we will end up worshipping something. And in these secular times, other words might be used, but worship is a good word for us Christians to understand this. That is, when you put something in your heart other than God, our humanity is diminished, and the end result, we end up somewhere we don't want to be. So it's very important to make the affirmation that God does not need us. God does not need us to confess, to be obedient, to worship, to honour God. All those activities are for our benefit. This has other implications because it comes down to motivation in a way, and self-giving, and how we find fulfilment. Take, for example, an example I have used before about the difference between acting out of guilt and acting out of compassion. When we help someone, if we do it out of guilt, the end result will be skewed for everybody, because it's not about self-giving, it's really about us. Compassion is about the other person. Of course, this is difficult, of course. But we could say that the more, and when Jesus talks about picking up our cross and following him, part of what that means is to mimic his self-giving for others. When in our discipleship we relate to each other, at which we should affirm that we all need each other. That is true. We're not individuals. We're not self-enclosed individuals with no needs. But the more that we act with other people for our own needs, that is, to make them a means to an end, with us and our needs as the end, the more we do that, the more likely the end result will be skewed and not what we wanted in the first place. The more that we can use all the spiritual exercises and all the wisdom handed down to us through the Christian tradition to refine out of our interactions our own needs, the more we will find our needs met, paradoxically. The person who wants to be good and tries to act good, although I'm all for people acting ethically and to be good, but the problem is when you try to be good for some other need, often the end result is not what you wanted in the first place. worth thinking about, that God is complete. And in God's self-giving, we have the model of self-giving for our benefit. We have the model for our relationships between each other, to each other. The more that we can give of ourselves for the other, the more the result will be what we probably wanted in the first place, and that will include our own fulfillment. Thank you. Bye-bye.